fucked up with that. Okay, fucking hell, what a difficult pain in the ass. This is, yeah, you're right, this is technical shit. I'm terrible at it, but I'm better than some people, but a lot worse than I should be. Right, so good evening, Eric. Sorry for the chaos I've just constructed here.
Chaos musician, sorcerer. I mean, there we go. Hey.
Yeah. Well, the idea is it's meant to be a little bit smoother, isn't it? A little bit more kind of sorted out. So the idea, as I say, the idea of these sessions. This is my Monday night session. So just to tell you what's going on. So I'm streaming this on Twitch. There's a couple of people watching, but we don't. It's not like an enormous audience or anything. But because I've been teaching on Monday nights on Twitch for the Free University of Brighton, I decided that I wanted to maybe see if I could continue the Monday evening space for philosophy. And I was thinking, one, I wanted to make it not a fixed idea. So I haven't got a particularly fixed idea. As you can see, that means it's a bit chaotic. It will smooth out, I imagine. But the idea is that each week I would kind of talk about my philosophical work that week, what I've been working on. And so there'll be maybe 2 or 3 little segments where I might talk about, say, the book we're working on or some work I've done on that, or I might talk about a bit about the Sartre that I'm working on, or, so for example, this week I just started attending a GCAS seminar on Deleuze. And so I might talk about that in future. And so it's, the idea is like it pushes me to do something on Monday night and to reflect on my work, and it opens a space in which like there's a public doing philosophy in public that isn't a classroom. It isn't a kind of academic space. It's also not really a podcast, and so I'd be kind of open to, people, if people wanted to talk about something specific, actually having a sort of philosophical conversation, research discussion. That's what I'm thinking of them, research discussions. And so I thought, since we have our weekly conversations anyway, then it would be a good place to start. So I will also, these are also recorded, and so I will can keep them easily recorded on Twitch and on YouTube and all this sort of stuff. So that was the general background of what I want to be doing on Monday nights. I have a chat channel that people can comment on, so occasionally there might be that kind of thing as well. There's a chat channel that comes through that people can sort of talk to in Twitch and things. So, I mean, does that make sense?
Sounds great.
Yeah, right. So, for people, obviously, people don't know who you are. So, Eric Harper is I mean, you can correct this as I go through terribly. Eric Harper is a psychoanalyst from London. Comes from South Africa. Has been an activist pretty much all his life with homeless people and sex workers. And he's currently working in a new job at Goldsmiths University, teaching psychoanalysis there. And me and Eric have been working for about 3 or 4 years on a book. The project's called Freudian Spaceship, but I think the book it's been sort of mutating as it goes along. And we managed the first part of it, probably finished the first part of it about 18 months ago, probably about 18 months to 2 years ago. And I think we've been working the last couple of years on what to do next. But I will talk about that book actually at other points during my Monday night sessions, I think. But what we do is, at the moment, we've got back together on Zoom on a weekly basis to have a conversation about what next with the project. And so that's what these conversations are. Does that make sense, Eric? Does anyone want to add anything to that?
No, that sounds fine. I suppose the second part is more around pragmatics, and the first part was more just theoretical conception. Maisha.
Hello, Maisha.
Get that out, just blocking her out. I've got a question. You've been reading Sartre at the moment.
Yeah, we were teaching. I was teaching. I was leading a sessions on Sartre's on existentialism, broadly speaking, and we started with Kierkegaard. But the second half of that was on Transcendence of the Ego, which is this early text by Sartre, in which he develops what he calls a pre-personal consciousness, and he has an argument in there that's against Husserl and against the need to have an I, that there's always an I whenever you have a consciousness, and that there's a kind of what he calls a pre-reflective mode in which there is no I, and a reflective mode in which there is an I. And the pre-reflective mode where there isn't an I always has the potential to have an I kind of attached to it as you move to the reflective, but he has this kind of interesting doubled notion of consciousness. And part of my interest in that was that it's referred to by Deleuze a number of times as a kind of important background text for some of Deleuze's and Deleuze and Guattari's work. And so that was part of my interest in looking closely at that again. And it's proved quite fascinating. Yeah, it's proved quite fascinating for me. And so we looked at Transcendence, the Ego, Sketch for a Theory of the Emotions, and the chapter on bad faith. You've heard of bad faith, I take. Yeah, the chapter on bad faith in being and nothingness. And so, yeah, I'm going to be continuing sort of pursuing that sort of some work around that, because there's some really interesting stuff there. And Sartre is quite often, I think, kind of ignored or put aside as an arch subjectivist. And in fact, he rejects quite clearly the category of the subject as a kind of core philosophical category later in his life, and even earlier in his life. His notion of the subject is really quite strange, because it has this, as I say, it's this consciousness that doesn't have an I, and that's the kind of the source of spontaneity in some ways. Yeah, I mean that was what I've been working on there, so I want to pursue that a little bit. Did you happen to see the little Instagram thing I put up about Deleuze and dreams the other day?
No. I'm still trying to get my head around all these different internet systems.
Crazy, isn't it? Crazy. I will come back to that later then, maybe.
Yeah. Freud has a notion of unconscious thought, and I'm wondering if there's any relationship between Freud's notion of unconscious thought and Sartre's preconscious I. Is the I is this I reflective or not? You said it's not reflective.
No, it's pre-reflective, and in fact, it's interesting that you bring up Freud, because he's posing his theory of consciousness specifically against psychoanalysis. So he's rejecting the unconscious completely, and he's posing it as and it's all organised. All the arguments are organised in many ways against psychoanalysis and against. I mean, there's a huge dispute between Freud and Sartre in Sartre's eyes, and so that's part of the other.
He doesn't want an unconscious, does he?
No.
Sartre. He doesn't want
No. He doesn't want anything that's not accessible, that's not transparent, or that in a sense is outside of our agency, that reduces us to somehow an effect of something. So he understands the unconscious to be something that we can't really access, we can't have control over, we can't have agency with regard to, and that produces us as a kind of passive effect. So, which I think is not unreasonable critique of psychoanalysis in many ways, and psychology as well. He has the same sort of problem with psychology in terms of its, in fact, any kind of naturalistic or scientific account that would sort of, explain why we do the things we do.
And his notion of a what did you call it? A pre-individual.
Well, he uses the phrase pre-personal, and he actually talks about it being a transcendental field. He uses the phrase there's a transcendental field of consciousness.
And Simondon's work is in no way related to this. The pre-individual.
George Simondon, you mean?
Yes.
Yes, I imagine there are some connections. They're sort of intellectual contemporaries in France. So I imagine there is some connection in a sense of that they're in the same kind of cultural context, same sort of intellectual context, but not that I'm aware of. Don't know any specifics about that. I'm not a Sartre expert. Couldn't tell you the intricacies of Sartre's sort of references that way.
Now, the only reason I'm asking these questions, I'm wondering, is there anything within Sartre that enables him to go beyond the human?
Is there anything that enables him to go beyond the human? No, I mean that's kind of yes and no. I mean, I think no is the answer I would want to give, in the sense in which he divides up the world into things in themselves, being in itself, and then which is like stuff that isn't conscious, and then being for itself, which is stuff that is conscious. So there's a kind of like strong distinction there, but I think there's I don't know how he would deal with this, but I'm kind of interested in how Sartre makes consciousness not reflective consciousness, not what we think of as human consciousness, where I know what I'm thinking and I'm here and I'm in my head, and not that kind. He kind of makes consciousness central, but changes it so much that I think actually it's possible, maybe by bastardizing him a bit, to actually find resources for like something that would go beyond the human in a sense. But I don't think Sartre would particularly. I think it would definitely be a kind of what's the phrase Deleuze uses as a buggery, isn't it? You take a philosopher and you try and sort of transform them or something behind. And so yeah, I'm kind of, maybe I'm approaching Sartre a bit like that, seeing what I can get out of it.
And Deleuze uses this in the chapter in Logic of Sense on Desert Island, if I remember correctly.
Well, Deleuze and Guattari seem to have this quite interesting relationship to Sartre, because they both call him their master, and so they have quite a strong sense of him being a precursor, maybe. That's my kind of sense of how the connection is that he's a kind of precursor to certain things that they're interested in, and some of what they're doing is maybe responding to limitations in Sartre. What are you looking for, mate?
I was looking for my Logic of Sense. I had it earlier on, and I was just wanting to read the actual chapter to you, the quote to you, but I can't seem to find it for now.
You know what chapter it's in?
Yes, it's in the thing on desert islands, on the section of desert islands.
Desert islands. Have I got my glasses? Which is the section on desert islands?
It's towards the end of the book, where he's talking about the French. He's talking about the French writer who wrote about Robinson Crusoe and Friday. I mean, a particular chapter of Deleuze's that I had a lot of problems with. I thought it was rather colonial in some ways.
Is this the Michel Tournier in The World Without Others?
Yes. I'm sure there's a direct quote to what you're talking about.
I'll have a quick squiz and see if I can see it.
Oh, I found it. Let's see.
307. Yeah, Being a Nothingness, 307. Let's have a look. I've got this old version of Logic of Sense here. It's all nice now, isn't it? It's all in the Continuum editions are lovely. 307. Yeah, I can see him referencing Sartre there, but I can't necessarily see whether there's any long quote, I'm afraid.
Okay. He did just remember him speaking about I think it was what you were talking about, the pre-individual. But
yeah, I'll have a look. I'm gonna have to obviously track back into Deleuze and Guattari once I've got a bit more sense of where Sartre is. I've got to do a little bit more work on some of the difficulties of this pre-reflective.
So I'll read it to you. By comparing the primary effects of the other's presence and those of his absence, we are in a position to say what the other is. The error of philosophical theories is to reduce the other sometimes to a particular object and sometimes to another subject. Even a conceptions like Sartre's in Being and Nothingness was satisfied with the union of two determinations, making of the other an object of my gaze, even if he in turn gazes at me and transforms me into an object. But the other is neither an object in the field of my perception, nor a subject who perceives me. The other is infinitely a structure of the perceptual field, without which the entire field could not function as it does. This structure may be actualized by real characters, by variable subjects, me for you and you for me, does not prevent its pre-existence as the condition of organizing in general. To the terms which actualize it in each organized perceptual field, yours and mine. Thus, the a priori other, as the absolute structure, establishes the relativity of others as terms actualizing the structure within each field. But what is the structure? It is the structure of the possible. A frightening countenance is the expression of a frightening possible world, or something frightening in the world, something I do not yet see. I was quite struck by the concept of the field there. That's kind of what stood out for me when I read that.
Say a bit more about that.
Well, I think if you have a notion of a field, and I think it starts with Kurt Lewin. He's a Gestalt. He's one of the founders of Gestalt theory. He starts with the notion of a field. A field is another way of saying a matrix. It's a matrix. It's a field. And what I like about that possibility is the field. It's a force field. It's a force field which includes subjective, intersubjective, transpersonal, but also could include pre-individual. So the field is something that includes the human, but goes beyond the human. It invites all kinds of possibilities. And perhaps the example would be a dream. A dream is a field. I think the problem is
there's something curious about dreams, isn't there, in that sense? Because obviously there's that kind of where we place dreams in relationship to something like consciousness is obviously quite problematic, you know. So yeah, I mean, because in a sense, obviously, you're not conscious when you're dreaming, by in a sense, by definition, almost. And yet that is the kind of implicit dreaming whilst asleep, dreaming in bed kind of notion, and I think that sometimes limits the idea of dream.
But the way I would see it is that that's what Freud refers to as the unconscious thoughts. Unconscious thoughts which are not dependent on a signifying chain. They're there, they're floating around. Or put another way, Beyond talks about ideograms. That it's very close to Bergson, in the sense that it's basically images. that these images that you sense in stuff. We're in a world of sensation, and that the image contains image is in a sense the ideogram for beyond, but they're very close, if not the same. It's It's a proto thought. Proto, as in it's what potentially could become a thought. So a proto thought, unconscious thought, it's within a field. One is affected, and one has these potential thoughts, which then can get constructed into some sort of narrative. Does the dream have a narrative? It's some sort of narration of something. One is affected by, one is having these images. They contain in something. One is sensing something, and this produces the possibility of creating an apparatus to think these thoughts, because an apparatus to think these thoughts. So these proto thoughts, Bergson's term, these images, are the first possibility of something that can be thought. But maybe then the question for Sartre is, I don't know what the question for Sartre would be around that. But
I think that's Sartre stuff is a kind of, it's worth, in a sense, putting it aside a little bit. My interest in the Sartre stuff is because he's incredibly focused on an emphasis on consciousness, and in a sense, he's a very. I mean, one of the things I was trying to sort of suggest during my course was that he's a strategic thinker. So his arguments are always deployed to try and prevent certain options and to try and avoid certain options that are kind of dominant or easily slipped into. So certain ways of thinking about, consciousness in particular, and then dominant option that he seems to want to avoid is anything that will, in a sense, remove agency, anything that will prevent that sense of capacity to. I mean, he has this wonderful phrase, to make something of what I've been made into, and that's kind of his definition of freedom: to be able to make something of what I've been made into, and that kind of to be able to make of it something. That tiny little element is where he locates freedom, and I think that's for me what's interesting in that he kind of wants to I mean, in a sense, avoid what we might loosely call any kind of social construction situation in which we're a product of society, or we're a product of nature, or we're a product of the unconscious drives. Because he thinks that any kind of starting, like any way of starting like that, if we begin from that kind of idea that we're a product, we've lost the idea that despite being made into something, we've still got this capacity to make something of what we've been made into. And that kind of, it resonates very strongly with me in terms of Marx, for example. There's a whole kind of relationship there to the way Marx would talk about, people being, in their situation, in their social and historical situation, but that doesn't mean that they're not. That doesn't mean they're just passive elements of their situation. And so I think that's what interests me about Sartre stuff. In terms of it's like a defense of consciousness, or a defense of freedom via consciousness. Probably to be more sort of explicit, he kind of defends freedom via a defense of consciousness.
It reminds me a lot of Frantz Fanon. Make me a body that always questions. And I'm thinking that, are you there? Sorry.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that Fanon was deeply engaged with Sartre.
Yeah, Fanon comes out of a kind of, and for background, obviously Fanon is one of the key kind of thinkers we're working with in our project. So, but Fanon, he comes out of a kind of existentialist framework in some sense. That's the contemporary intellect.
He was friends with Sartre.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the biography. I know that different. I mean, I know that Sartre gets reports from different people for sometimes being an arsehole, but I think that's kind of they're always mixed up with bits of biography and stuff. But yeah, I mean, Fanon comes out of that kind of intellectual framework in which Sartrean existentialism is a really big aspect of intellectual culture at the point of like 40s, 50s, and as the sort of anti-colonial movement begins to rise, he's a big facet of the intellectual world, and what he calls an engaged. I mean, Sartre called himself an engaged, intellectual. So he was quite explicit and open about the kind of political engagement that philosophy has, a social and political engagement that philosophy has that it can't really avoid. And so there's an element of that. I mean, I have to be true. I mean, Sartre is also someone I came across in my undergraduate years who I really loved. So, I mean, there's a kind of element of that sort of an old love that you're kind of interested in again, in reference to a particular project. I mean, I think the idea of like thought as a kind of a pre-personal or a pre-individual field. Again, if we want to sort of push that outside of an anthropocentric or a human orientated way, I mean, and I'm just sort of thinking out loud here, but if you were to push it into certain areas like animal consciousness, let's not say that necessarily. There's no need to get tied up with that word, but we can tell that animals are aware, even if we don't want to use the word consciousness. There's some kind of an awareness there. And that awareness is, I think, sometimes a little bit closer to what Sartre would think of as pre-reflective, except it doesn't have this capacity to say I, supposedly. But that kind of awareness that animals have of the world around them. So let's say, I mean, do we want to at any point call those thoughts? I mean, that's obviously going to be resisted quite heavily by a lot of people. Particularly philosophers who seem to want to immediately exclude anything other than humans from ever having a thought. And there's a sense in which, I mean, I can be very sympathetic to that. There's a sense in which thought is something very odd that looks like it needs something like a human consciousness or something akin to a human consciousness at times, particularly when philosophers talk about things like infinite thought, the idea of thought being able to reach a kind of infinite speed or an infinite slowness, and sort of, talk about those things that are, I mean, infinite thought, that idea of the mirror reflecting upon a mirror and that constant sort of back and forth, and being able to kind of hold that in a thought and have your thoughts sort of be able to sort of traverse all of that space in an instant. That's in a sense a kind of a notion of an infinite thought. Now, that kind of situation seems to me quite distinct from the way in which we might talk about thinking awareness that crosses over from animal into human, that is more broadly found than just in the human situation. But even in the animal situation, that kind of reduction that we make animals just the result of evolutionary development. So everything they do can be explained by just, essentially a kind of crude evolutionary psychology. And then that, I think, gets transferred into the human. The human gets turned into a kind of animal. Everything can be explained, The reason you like a particular face is because of symmetry, because of evolutionary, slight developments. The reason you like breasts or strong arms is because of, evolutionary drives or whatever. And all of that seems to me to be really... I want to kind of resist a lot of that. I find it quite difficult to work out how any sense of freedom is left after that. But I don't know. I'm kind of a bit... As soon as you go past the human, as soon as you try seriously not to take the human as your central point of what thinking is.
Well, I've got a few responses to what you... So I've got 4 responses. The first one is why I mentioned Fanon, because Fanon's body that always questions, it wants to create a new species. For Fanon, it's a new species of man, but for us, it's a species which includes man but goes beyond the human. My second thought was in relation to what you were saying around this consciousness and this thinking, and I was thinking of the sensory and the motor, and the reflective is that which comes between the sensory and the motor. That's in Bergson, that's also in Freud. And I was wondering whether that's close to what Sartre was talking about, that you can have this reflective state. The reflective state is often seen as human. And that comes to my third thought. I wondered if the reflective state, as you have previously said, is actually cunning, state of being cunning, where it's more about the collision of territories. So there's these sensory affects, and then there is going to be the motor, the body just reacts to it. But there's a reflective moment where the animal becomes cunning in relation to things. It becomes cunning, which potentially is a thought. And then I forgot the last thought. It'll probably come back, but yeah. You were talking about human consciousness. Consciousness.
Well, there are certain sort of problems, aren't they? Whenever we kind of want, or if we want to think consciousness, outside of like, as I say, the anthropocentric or the human starting point. There seems to be two dangers. One, you end up reducing consciousness to little more than a kind of a cognitive function. That's I think a trendy word nowadays, isn't it? Cognitive. They like cognition. So it ends up being a kind of, it's modelled on a calculator or a computer. It's modelled on that sort of cybernetic, sort of, there's a central processing unit of some kind that has, everything goes into and everything comes back out of. And in that situation, it seems like you've lost any kind of sense of freedom. You're back into a kind of, if you knew exactly how everything worked, you can predict everything, and that from humans through animals, etc. So that's kind of one danger of like reducing consciousness in some ways, and the other danger is of making it sort of too specific, too special. And then you've just got this magical thing that's popped into the universe at some point, or that a human being sort of, as an animal, as a baby, as a kind of biological entity, at a certain point somehow they're endowed with, or they come into being conscious. And all of these things seem to me, they both seem to have quite big dangers. It's nice as a philosopher to obviously, think about all the kind of wonderfully curious, specific things that thinking is, and also as a philosopher you often get the trope amongst philosophers of like, people aren't thinking yet, kind of Heideggerian trope. It's we're not yet thinking, we're not yet thinking. Philosophy is so damn hard, and actually it's really difficult to get to a point at which you can ever have a thought. And I'm never quite sure what they think that thought is. It always seems to be described in affective terms. It's like some sort of emotional state or some sort of specific, mystical state that they reach. Yeah, I'm kind of like I don't know whether we're faced with a complete double bind. Either we just get rid of the whole concept of consciousness completely, which I think for a long time is my preferred strategy. Just dump it. This is a bad concept. This doesn't work. Or whether actually, whether there's some point of trying to get hold, whether there's some point of trying to get hold of it that doesn't keep us returning back into just this sort of human way, where in the end, we're trapped in things like ideologies or whatever. We're trapped in kind of ways in which our consciousness has been formed, but again, not really with any freedom or any agency or any kind of spontaneity, all those kind of things.
Well, I mean, what the beyond line of argument is that you need an apparatus to think thoughts. And ideally, if the ego can tolerate some frustration, it has the potential to become an apparatus to think thoughts. But the thinking of these thoughts is actually, interestingly, starts with dreaming. dreaming is the precursor or the road to thought. But what I was wondering also was about Sartre's relationship to Nietzsche, because what I've been thinking about quite a bit of late is the question of some sort of epistemological or drive to know. I think Nietzsche has a drive to know.
Yeah.
So in a sense, instead of this cognition, if thinking is actually something that it's a manifestation of something that drives us, because if it is a manifestation of something that drives us, that the drive automatically takes us to the animal. The animal, it's our linkage to the animal, but that there is this drive to know, which in the human could potentially become a certain kind of consciousness, but in the animal become a certain kind of cunningness.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Nietzsche. So Nietzsche has a sense. I mean, he uses this phrase "amor fati," yes, the love of fate, and he has this kind of which I think he draws out of Spinoza, actually, or at least it's very close to Spinoza, and I think he notices that at some point and says something like, Spinoza is the forerunner of my thoughts, and there it's a kind of I wouldn't say acceptance, but that's kind of the word that's coming to mind. It's a kind of acceptance of my lack of control, the kind of acceptance of the fact that I am possessed by the drives, possessed by the will to power, possessed by these movements, and my sense of control is just another form of this possession. It's a kind of an easing of the pain of feeling like you're caught up in the flow of the world, and you're caught up in a world that is meaningless and yet still moving, and so that's, I think, Sartre, for Nietzsche, that there's an element of that in his work, and that's obviously a massive simplification. But what's kind of curious is that Sartre opposes freedom. For him, one of the things that was interesting is that the opposite of freedom is not determination. Yes, you often have this kind of, it's free will or determinism. That's the kind of traditional split. You've either got free will or you're determined, and so that's the kind of difficulty, and that's sort of part of the difficulty that's behind some of my thoughts. But for Sartre, the opposite of freedom is fate. It's that sense that the world is beyond your control. That you're, again, it's this relationship to his defense of freedom via consciousness is precisely a defense of freedom in the face of a consciousness that would go, well, there's nothing I can do. The world is organized like this, classic, there is no alternative, etc., etc. Or I've got a destiny. It's the other version of fate, isn't it? I've got a destiny. I can't help but do this. All these kind of phrases in which we kind of give over the control and the sense of any kind of capacity of freedom to a world in which we're just buffeted in the winds. We're just we're just kind of caught in the stream. And of course, the interesting thing is when you turn against the stream and you flow backwards and you go up the stream rather than go with it. So I'm not sure whether there's a really strong distinction between Nietzsche and Sartre. I think there probably is in some ways, where Nietzsche is almost like how to learn to swim in the stream and not be dissipated perhaps, and Sartre's still like now how to learn to swim against the stream. I think there's almost that kind of there still is that kind of distinction there, but that's probably massively simplified, and there's all sorts of problems with that. But I think those differences, because I think one of the difficulties I'm having with our work at the moment, on thinking through our work, is that if your descriptions explain how things operate, and when they explain how let's say racial capitalism, or the kind of way in which capital flows, but if these descriptions are so strong that they make a perfect explanation, then you lose the capacity to then turn back and think, well, how can I change the way things operate? How can I reorientate the world? How can I reorganize that world? And that's kind of, in a sense, I think that's almost the, I've been wondering about where politics comes in, but that's almost where politics kind of comes in, or at least it's the condition for any kind of politics, is that politics is not just business as usual. which is how it's presented to us, isn't it? I mean, we have a kind of counter with politicians as all the bloody same and just business as usual, etc., etc. So it's like actually politics begins precisely in a sense, when you're able to perceive that you can change business as usual, when the business, the normal flow of things, fate or all the kind of structures of the world, these things are not fixed. Now, that level of freedom, I think, must have degrees. It must. I think there are a kind of level of degrees there in which other, what Deleuze and Guattari called alloplastic entities that change the environment around them rather than just be determined by the environment. And a lot of animals are in that kind of category. The most famous, obviously, things like beavers. They're alloplastic because they change the environment around them. I mean, that changing of the environment around you, I think, is a kind of like a first degree of freedom almost. And not even, I mean, that doesn't even have to be like orientated with a future. It doesn't have to be sort of intentional in that sense, but that capacity to change the environment around you, to make changes in the flow, to reorganize the apparatus, when you're talking about something like an apparatus, to reorganize those things, that seems to me to be like the first degree of freedom. And if we take it like that, then it is almost possible to see how you can push that all the way down the organic level, all the way down the organic level, because that's going to, in a sense, almost a kind of, from the cellular onwards, that capacity to begin to change the environment around you rather than just simply be changed by the environment in this kind of weird dualism. That seems to me to be perhaps a way of keeping a notion of freedom, which then seems to me to be important for any kind of politics, any kind of idea of politics, is that you have to have somehow some way of understanding, well, why on earth are we able to make any difference?
I'm just very struck by how often you've mentioned the word freedom tonight. I mean, in fact, I've never heard you use the word freedom so often.
Yeah, probably not.
But I had two thoughts on that. The one was that to some extent, freedom is almost like a dirty word in academic circles these days. But I was also thinking that for half the world's population, or probably more than half, in terms of the popular experience, it's such an important word. And for all those behind bars,
Yeah.
a very important word. Even though that might be, in terms of philosophical circles, quite not simplistic. But in terms of, as you say, restricted space, or interestingly, just to go back to animals, or to go to the advent of the coronavirus, if we accept that theory. I mean, there's some people who dispute that it started in China, but let's just say, as a working hypothesis, that COVID started the same way pig flu and swine flu started. It took a life form, confined it, prodded it, pushed it around, tortured it, broke down its immunity. So it just became some sort of molecular structure open to colonizations by viruses, and then kills this life form. And in this process, it mutated into something else, almost in a sense spoke back. But for the bats or the snakes, the chickens or the pigs, swine flu, bird flu, for the animal rights activists, freedom is such a bloody central concept at a very, very practical level. And Sartre was in a camp during the war, and Sartre was someone who was never afraid of going on political marches. People make fun of that he was marching for everything, but they can make fun. But they were probably just sitting in their chairs and reading, but he actually went to the streets.
Yeah, I mean the word freedom. I suppose that's an odd one, isn't it? I think that possibly comes from the way in which I've separated out for a long time my political thought and activity from my philosophical activity, which is something that I think a kind of split that I developed when I was doing undergraduate philosophy and as I began to do postgraduate work, and I kind of increasingly separated out these two elements because I didn't think philosophy had anything to say about politics. I thought it was completely absent of any engagement with actual politics. Now, obviously, that's because I came from a revolutionary left background, and so, whenever philosophers did talk about politics, they talked about it within that kind of liberal rights framework primarily, and within that framework of like civil society and all this kind of like single social in which we're all in it together and we're all trying to work out what's going on. And for me, coming from a kind of revolutionary left background, politics was something that the academy had no capacity to get a hold of, because it was precisely something always in resistance to that. It was always outside of that. It was always always interested in questions that would always seem naive, and kind of and it was about force and power and capacity. Now I don't any longer divide, and in part the work we've been doing recently in the book has kind of really solidified that problem for me. Is I no longer divide politics from consciousness, in a sense, but I think the connection is possibly via this kind of concept of something like agency or freedom, or something along those lines.
I find that a bit perplexing, Matt, because the common point for both you and Sartre is Marx. And I would have thought that would have been the link.
Yeah, I mean, I was always like, Marx is not a philosopher. Marx is something else. I mean, nowadays you'd probably call him a theorist. That's the lovely word, isn't it? Everyone's a theorist. And so, and I took philosophy to be something that was obsessed with right thought, if you like, right thought. And had an idea that right thought came before right action, and that was kind of the basic structure of how philosophy operated. Whereas I always, and I still kind of do in a sense, think politics comes the other way round. You have to act and experiment, and then you have to kind of reflect and think. But if you don't act, then there's nothing.
Do you think Sartre also saw Marx in that way, or do you think he saw him as a philosopher?
No, I think he probably saw him as a philosopher, but he didn't engage philosophic. I mean, his initial engagement is with philosophers like Husserl and Heidegger.
Yes, but he ends up with Marx.
He doesn't touch people like Lukács or something. The nearest we might have at that point is someone like Georges Lukács, who writes this book, History and Class Consciousness. It's very popular amongst certain left groups, like the SWP were very into this history and class consciousness while I think during the 70s. And there's a lot of other kind of work inside philosophy that was in a Marxist tradition that was kind of connected to the Soviet Union and all this kind of stuff. A guy called Ilyenkov, and there's a whole bunch of people that are around, and they were always like separate. Their discourse was and their way of talking and the people they were talking to were completely sort of, in a sense, outside of the academy. As I say, I no longer have such a crude schematic split, but part of that is because I've been increasingly thinking about this relationship to consciousness raising, something that comes from Mark Fisher, and I'm involved in Plan C, so that's kind of there as part of the background to that, and obviously the relationship now to Fanon and the way in which Fanon sort of connects these two things intimately, when in his work on colonialism, and so that's kind of, in both of those elements, I think, have changed my thinking about the sort of the relationship between philosophy and politics. But I'm still now in this problem of like, I'm not entirely sure how to articulate these myself.
Do you know much about Merleau-Ponty? Was he influenced? Was he a Marxist in any way? Because I mean, Merleau-Ponty's relationship to Fanon, and also I'd be very curious about his relationship to Sartre, because I think he's a potentially interesting person to push in terms of Sartre, to push Sartre against.
Yeah, I
was wondering
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a strong connection with Merleau-Ponty. I mean, so Sartre, de Beauvoir, Camus, Merleau-Ponty, they're all kind of a big set of a group of people that are kind of key to French existentialism phenomenology. But I think they were dealing a lot at the time when they were encountering Marxism or communism as an idea or any of these kind of things. I think they were dealing a lot with the fact of the appalling, destruction of communist ideas through Stalin and through the Soviet Union and through the way in which essentially, the way it played out was a fucking mess, an absolute fucking mess. And so, in the 50s or something, you're kind of faced with this horrific dichotomy in the world in which, the ideas of communism have just become another part of a massive, global conflict rather than that it's not that's not in a sense intended to break open anything. It's just another war of position. It's just another kind of fixed set of authoritarian leaders maintaining their power against each other. So I think they were in that context, and I don't think there was an awful lot of space. Sartre develops more of a relationship to Marxism, I think, late in the 50s and 60s, as he kind of has to take a position in that dispute, and he constantly takes the position of siding with the left, which is the Communist Party. But of course, it's a position of compromising yourself, because you end up, having to back people who are murderous arseholes, against another bunch of people who are murderous arseholes. And so you're choosing, murderer one over here against murderer one over there, and you find similar kind of things nowadays in certain sort of, young lefties who validate Mao and Stalin as kind of like, well, they did the thing that was necessary and all this kind of stuff. Some of which is in a sense true, but it wasn't the only thing that could have been done, and the way in which it was done was horrific and just appalling. But so I mean, I don't think Merleau-Ponty or the existentialists were kind of I don't think they were engaging with Marxism as a revolutionary practice. They were still kind of engaging with it perhaps as an intellectual practice, as a way of thinking about the world rather than changing the world. And I think that was kind of part of the difficulty I always had with the kind of the relationship between the two, philosophy on the one hand and politics on the other. And even Merleau-Ponty's most famous book, it's called The Phenomenology of Perception. And like a lot of good philosophy, it's like all about how we as a kind of subject or consciousness is in relationship to the world, how we can know the world, how we can know each other, how knowledge is possible. I mean, these are the classical philosophical questions, aren't they? And I think they're not fundamentally political questions. I think the political question is always, how can you change? How can you alter something? How can you, and you don't need to have a pre-existing knowledge of exactly how that will happen. In fact, that's not even possible to have a pre-existing knowledge of how that's going to happen in the long run. But how you make change, I think, is a political question. And as I say, the philosophers are just almost, how do you know shit? How do you know this? How do you know that? How is it possible for you?
Well, my reply would be, you have a dream.
Right. And I think I agree with this. And I think I'm with you with this one, which is kind of one of the reasons. I mentioned this thing earlier. I'll dig it out. I'll see if I can show. I'll see if I can show you so you can see it. I don't know whether this will work. Let's see. If I can show you. Let's try this. You should. Yeah. Oh, it's wiggled up my thing. Yeah. Just bring that up. Yeah, that's not going to work. Screw things up. Hang on a sec. Go back. That. So this is. I'll read it for you. So this is Deleuze, and it's that little bit. You said about him being trapped in the dream of another.
You fucked. Yeah, basically.
Yeah. Right. So this is just his phrase. It was. I found it the other day, and I was really fascinated to see the context of it. So this is the sort of bit of the context of what he says. This is Deleuze. The dream of those who dream concerns those who are not dreaming. Let me finish this a sec. Hang on. So the dream of those who dream concerns those who are not dreaming. Dreams have a terrible will to power. And each one of us is a victim to the other's dreams. Beware of the other's dreams, because if you are caught in the other's dreams, you are done for. Now, what was really interesting there was this idea that dreams have a will to power. And not just being caught in the other's dreams. And I like the concept of dreams because I think it can be used to replace the concept of ideology and false consciousness. You know, that kind of thing that we're always being told that somehow we just need to be educated to get rid of, you know, and we have to educate everyone and they'll see how the world really is. A really problematic thing, I think. But that sense of a dream having a will to power, a dream being able to, by which I mean I think that the dream itself will gather the dreamers. It will gather the people to it. It will
I would say the dream is visionary. And in a sense, Nietzsche and Fanon were visionaries. And I'm using the word visionary, and I'm thinking and it's interesting, you know. I've been listening to my daughter, and she's at a phase now where she asks a lot of why and what. And I thought the reason why this is such a perplexing question, people get confused by this question, is she's basically has what Bion refers to, and Freud uses a similar term, binocular vision. And Bion says that we need binocular vision. What does he mean by that? We need a vision which, he says, at some level you need to be artificially blinded. He's quoting Freud, where you are both seeing the conscious world and you see in the unconscious world. So when my daughter says to me, why or what, she's not simply wanting an answer as to, when I'm switching the light on, why?
Yeah.
I can explain to her that there's currency, there's magnetic fields, etc., etc. Well, I mean, whatever, you know, whatever. But she's also wanting about intentionality. Because this is the way I've been programmed, my relationship to light or whatever. There's a question, the vision is going both ways. The vision is also in terms of my motivation. But in that sense, I think that Fanon and Nietzsche, and Fanon was actually very fond of Nietzsche, very fond of Nietzsche. I think that they're visionaries, but I think that they also have this binocular vision. It's a vision not just at the level of, it's operating at different planes simultaneously.
So this binocular, this twofold vision you're talking about is like being able to see both like outwards and inwards. Is that what you're kind of?
Exactly.
Or forwards and backwards.
Yes, it's, in other words, it's to be able to see in other words, in a sense, it's to be partially blinded, that the blind man sees. But there's also the actual seeing as well. But often there's an expression, and one of my descriptions of trauma, which dawned on me. I was running this group for people exposed to violence in a place called Manenberg. It had one of the highest levels of violence in her area, well, in South Africa, possibly. Phenomenal amount of violence. I was speaking to somebody who grew up in the area, and they were working with the gangs, etc., etc. And she said, the thing about coming to this group, and I've never forgotten this expression, and I've used it, I was seeing things without seeing what I'm seeing, but by coming to this group, I'm starting to see what I saw without seeing.
Right. Which, I mean, I think is probably a description people involved in therapy generally would find quite resonant in many ways. I mean, I'm thinking because my partner is working through therapy at the moment, and that sounds resonant to some of the things, some of the ways in which she might sort of. I mean, one of the phrases I've heard from her is why does it take me to, you know, a specific situation where I'm sitting in a session to be able to realize something that seems in a sense so kind of obvious and that I already knew, or I felt, you know, and so I think that kind of shift in perception that you're talking about there, would that be right? A kind of shift in perception, a kind of change of the eye line, a change of what you're a change of the tone and saturation of the world around you, or even the organisation of the world around you. So you can now see certain things that you couldn't previously.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very suspicious of therapy because I'm a therapist, and
I am suspicious of philosophy because I'm a philosopher. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I don't want to make therapy something heroic. I'm thinking more of that comment by Huxley in relation to Darwin, and Huxley became one of the ardent defenders of Darwin. It was so obvious. Why didn't I see it or think it? Darwin's theory. Oh, it was so obvious. And I'm also thinking in a sense of just being positioned at a certain point. I was thinking about, as you were speaking about freedom, the position I was taking was in terms of the archive, the margins, and I was very much thinking around, or Deleuze's expression, to work on the wall, resistance, to work on the wall. And then Foucault's response is, I'm no prophet unless it means to create windows where there were once walls. I love that expression. And I love to collapse Deleuze's working on the wall and creating windows where there were walls. And creating windows where there were walls, in a sense, creates a vision. It creates a possibility. But maybe I'm drifting away from this scene without seeing what you've seen, and maybe I've got a resistance to trying to bring it back to therapy. I get away from that.
I mean, one of the resistances I have to a certain reading of Deleuze and Guattari is a reading in which, and this I think applies to some resistances I have to the reading of like critical theory or philosophy, is the idea that with the right theory at the right moment, as it were, you can massively change your perception, and you can suddenly, see the world anew, and that this is which I don't think is wrong, actually. I think that's kind of true, but that this is enough to be political. This is enough to make political change, and this is kind of I have a problem with this, because in the end I think, and this, I think, is a problem that we're kind of seeing played out in the Black Lives Matter struggle in America at the moment. I wouldn't say anywhere else in the world, but in America at the moment, in which, there's a huge desire amongst a large chunk of the population to, change their perception, educate themselves, crucially important, all that sort of stuff. But at the same time, what's interesting is that is being played out in Portland and in various other places in America, not as an education or a change of perception, but as conflict. And actually, what you're seeing is, the thing recently was people taking leaf blowers down to demonstrations to blow away the tear gas. And as soon as I heard that, I thought, oh God, what a fantastic idea. So, when you're talking about, why didn't I think of that? That was my recent moment. It's like, yeah, why didn't I think of that? Leaf blowers to get rid of the tear gas on demonstrations. That's a fantastic idea. Yeah, you should have leaf blower squads. Can we, I was thinking, this is the political, I was thinking, oh, should we as Plan C have a little leaf blower squad, going down to demonstrations to blow away tear gas? We don't have the same problem in the UK at the moment. So that those two elements of, like, the education element, the change how you see things, encounter what structural racism is, begin to encounter how that might play out, begin to think about all the difficulties there, have the conversations. That's kind of crucial, but it's not immediately sort of connected to, or it doesn't flow into or produce the conflict. Although obviously it produces the conditions for the conflict. It's not itself. The education is not itself going to take people into a situation in which they realise, actually, no, we need to make a change, not ask for one, not sort of say, please change the world for us, but actually make the change themselves, which is going to inevitably end up in that conflict situation where, there are going to be forces that want to resist that. And I think that's where, and I've spoken to you before, so we have this idea of these three different elements to our Fanonian schizoanalysis, yeah? So the one-to-one, the group, and the community. And so it's that move to the community where there's resistance and conflict. That it seems to me there's a kind of different dynamic, and there's the same sort of thing here. And I think even when I think of, like, the specificity of that change in perception. I'm not sure. I mean, I think that's almost a human characteristic, that capacity to somehow change the way the world looks without actually changing the world.
And talking about community, Askio restroom, and can these people, the ones who I don't know if anyone is listening to this conversation, can they comment?
Can you see what can you see? You see chat.
I see online 3 Askio restroom and something else. I don't know if anyone else is actually listening to this or not.
That's possibly.
But if they are, it'd be nice to hear.
That's possibly
nice
on
to
Facebook.
Hear their comments.
Well, this is streaming. They may be. It's streamed to Facebook and to Twitch, but I mean, I'm still trying to work out my setup. And people are listening. They can comment, but I'm not yet able to work out a setup that's coherent enough. That's going to take me a little while before I can get that worked out. I'm still trying to test those things out.
The interface of the one-to-one group in the community.
Yes, exactly.
Now, what I was just thinking, Matt, was that I get so nauseous. Well, I had 2 thoughts. One is I was thinking in terms of Sartre. It's very interesting that Sartre responds to affect, nausea.
Yeah,
that's in a sense that's his political motivation. It seems to be it's nausea. That I mean, I don't know Sartre well enough, but I mean, it's definitely there. But I get so, I can't describe how frustrated, angry, just when there's this talk of some sort of intellectuals driving, or even having important things to say in terms of revolutionary or activist moments. And I mean, one thing I've learned, and I've said this to you a long time ago, but I learned this from very, very long. I mean, I've known this for a long time. Education is not about thinking. It's not about thinking. It can enhance thinking. Or it can be an auxiliary to thinking. That'd probably be a better way of saying it. Or can be a complement to thinking. But there are people who are not educated who can definitely think.
Oh yeah, God. I mean, I think and almost crucially. I mean, this is the point behind some of the things like the deschooling movement. Almost crucially, is like the way in which people are educated is almost designed to stop us thinking. It's almost designed to stop us thinking. I mean, I think, to me, thought occurs in resistance. So, and I think that I would take that to mean something very simply. So, at the point at which I don't have enough food, whether I'm an animal or a human, at the point at which I'm kind of resisting my hunger, if you like, I'm forced to try and deal with the world around me in perhaps a new way. I'm forced to look for something new. I'm forced to, in a sense, think about how I can deal with this problem, how the problem can be encountered in a way that doesn't just make me its victim or make me passive. And so, and this is the idea that, in a sense, thought is forced. It's not something you can do voluntarily, and education, in a sense, or philosophy, or even psychoanalysis, in a sense, can enable you to create situations in which you can, produce a problem for yourself. You can produce something that's going to force you to think. But actually, most of the time, we're forced to think by the shit of the world around us and by the fact that it's so crazy, and certain things are just so crazy, and you see this kind of fantastic way in which people can come up with all sorts of brilliant ideas about how the world can be organized better, how things can be done better, and part of that is a way of them responding to the fucked upness of the world. But often the way in which people come up with how to make the world better, it seems to be at a level that's too high or too abstract. Quite often the most, someone has just said necessity is the mother of invention. Yes, I think that's almost kind of, thought has to be kind of forced out of necessity rather than out of, a kind of voluntary, I'm going to, or a genius or any of these kind of things. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how far we're going to pursue that.
No, I just got one response to what you were saying. Do you know, does Sartre or any of the philosophers you know speak about cunning? The only person I know who uses the term is R.D. Laing, and he was very influenced by Sartre. and I only know one reference to it, but it would make absolute sense. He was talking about surviving being driven mad. And he says you have to be sly, secretive, and cunning.
Yes.
And
I don't think it's a phrase or a word that is common inside philosophy. There is, I've done some work on the cunning, generally, and there is some work on what's called metis, metis, in the Greeks. So there is a kind of a small amount of work done in philosophy on the way in which this metis was a Greek concept that wasn't really knowledge. Wasn't that, it might be something almost, it might be translated almost like practical knowledge by some people, but it's, as far as I understand, closer to the idea of cunning, and being someone who's cunning, and I think that kind of, as you know, I think that kind of a relationship to cunning is what I would think of as almost a kind of proto thinking, or an actual thinking that's not framed inside of consciousness or framed inside of language. And so, like the people who are taking the leaf blowers down to blow away the tear gas on the demonstrations in America, it's a kind of, that's a kind of cunning response. It's like, how can you, it's done in such a way that it has all sorts of wonderful little sort of significations around it. It's so suburban. It's taking this intensely suburban instrument, into this kind of conflict, and it's a kind of, it's a kind of response that solves the problem, and is like, as I say, it's kind of obvious in a way. But
what is the difference between cunning and freedom?
Well, as I say, I think if freedom is something like the capacity to make changes, then cunning is perhaps one of the ways in which that first materializes. There's a certain sort of, it's like almost like a first degree of freedom is to be able to have a response that isn't programmed, a response that isn't a response. The response has a gap between the stimulus and the response, and in that gap, which, in that sort of short space of time between, the input and the output, that kind of empty time, as sometimes Deleuze calls it when he's talking about that, in that empty time, there's the possibility of other options, and so it's a kind of first degree of freedom, and the first moment of that option sort of being put into practice, as it were, or being actualized, to use a Deleuze and Guattari kind of notion. But the first actualization of empty time as freedom would be a kind of a response to the world that's a cunning response, and one that kind of, in a sense, has taken the world almost as a totality, to use a Sartrean phrase, almost as a whole, and like thought, well, if I adjust this, if I, and you don't even have to consciously go, but the adjustment of that, the felt adjustment of the world, is a kind of cunning response. And so when the wolves are hunting, there's a kind of cunning there in the way in which they will hunt as a pack and track and move and stuff, and those things aren't simply, and you will find better and worse hunters amongst those animals, and the better are the ones perhaps that have got that capacity to sort of be inventive, have that moment of cunning, hide themselves when they can, and show themselves when they must, and show themselves sometimes in order to make things run. That's one of the earliest elements of like hunting is to trap, and to place a trap is a kind of moment of cunning, and obviously we see animals presenting traps and producing traps in their hunting behavior. Now, whether that operates in herd animal, then right, and we've got a different kind of notion there, because I think that concept would kind of break down in that relationship. I'm not entirely sure how it would work, but then again, herd animals have a huge variance. The herd animal of the elephant is a huge difference from the herd or the swarm of the rats. You know what I mean? And, so there's a huge difference there. Anyway, I'm aware it's 9:05.
Whatever you want.
yeah, but we've both got families to go back to.
No, whatever you want. I can stop, or I can carry on. Whatever you want. I suppose I was just curious, but just tell me when you want to stop. I can stop as well.
Let's stop in about 5-10 minutes then, yeah.
So we catch a train called cunning and we catch a train called freedom. In terms of literally pragmatically, where's the one going to take me that the other one's not going to take me?
Okay, so it's the same train, but the first stop is cunning. Let's say it's like that. The first stop is like the first encounter, or the first kind of encounter with the train's movement is in this relationship. But that's a terrible analogy in some ways, because obviously you're sitting on the train passively, aren't you? I think it would be more. I'll have to think of a better example. I'll have to go back to what I was thinking about in that.
A last question then. Your thoughts on Sartre and Genet? I mean, because some people have felt that he totally territorialized Genet. But well, I thought of Genet because I was wondering whether Genet was a cunning character. Perhaps not. He landed up in prison.
He was a thief, though, so. I'm kind of assuming that, if you're a thief, you've at least got the basics of cunning. You've at least got the basics of working out how to slip in and slip away and obtain what you want without getting caught every time. But actually having been in prison and talked to people who are thieves, that's not quite how it works. It does seem quite often to be a bit more spontaneous in the vast majority of cases, and a bit more opportunistic, and quite often to be a mess rather than an organised and kind of coherent dynamic. I mean, in terms of Genet, I haven't read his book on Genet, so I would be interested to have a read through that. Genet plays a really powerful role for Sartre, because when I said earlier that Sartre has this idea that freedom, there's a small space of freedom, a small slither or a small sort of space in which we can encounter freedom, and it's in this capacity to make something of what you've been made into. And Genet is the example he gives, and so Genet is made into a thief. And so he's responding to the world around him in such a way as to survive, and because of necessities, as to sort of deal with the world around him using that particular strategy. And he encounters the negatives of that, the prison, etc., etc. And so he's made into a thief. That's the role he's sort of given in life as it comes. And then out of that role, he makes himself into a poet. And so that's how Sartre kind of takes Genet to be a kind of example of freedom. Now, in that sense, I wouldn't kind of take that to be a territorialization or a kind of rewriting of Genet's life, although Sartre just writes phenomenal amounts of words, just enormous amounts of words. And so he's probably rewritten Genet's life completely. And so if I go and look at Genet's books again and read Genet's books, which I haven't read for years, actually. I mean, I read Genet's books when I was in my 20s and 30s. Then that element
the way you've just presented Sartre, you've made him a queer theorist.
Well, right. So this is part of my interest in Sartre. Is I think he's been completely thrown out, and actually, when you go and look back, there's this enormous set of resources in there, and enormously interesting ideas beyond the kind of the popular stuff that is at the front and the way in which he's presented inside the academy. But that may just be, as I say, it may just be a personal response based on the fact that I, was in love with Sartre and that sort of stuff in, my younger years. And sort of, I mean, but it's definitely, it's definitely what's brought the word freedom back into my vocabulary and conceptual.
I was just thinking that the way you're speaking about it, it's very close to queer theory, strategy. Taking the very word, you're going to shame me, you're going to mortify me, you're going to imprison me by calling me queer. Well, I'm going to take this term queer, and I'm going to basically, to use Genet's expression, I'm going to doubly fuck you, so I'm going to be twice the man.
Yeah, I mean that.
To fuck a man is to make you twice a man, but but to turn it around and just to use it as, because in that moment there's a freedom
and a conflict and a resistance. I mean that's cool. That's kind of crucial. It's like it's again it's a kind of forced freedom. This is the contradictory element, I suppose, I'm in now. It's a kind of forced freedom. It forces you into a position in which you have a capacity to respond freely. That is not easy. But that capacity is kind of encountered in that moment at which you're forced into the position.
So the moment that you're essentialized, and Sartre wrote about the essentialization of a Jew, and I think Fanon might have used this, but then that's in a sense kind of what happened to Freud. I mean, Freud didn't particularly see himself as Jewish; he saw himself as German. But when he was essentialized then he could turn it around and do something with it. So it's in a sense, it's a freedom within the moment of, you're going to make me queer, you're going to make me nigger. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to actually flip it upside down.
You cannot use that word on Twitch. You cannot use that word in a public forum. It's okay, I'll cut it out. But just to say, you can't use that word in the public forum. I know what you're saying, though. But yes, when you're trying to make something back of what you've been made into, it's a kind of interesting strategy. And particularly if you identify that as what freedom consists in, that capacity to make something of what you've been made into, then you're faced with, okay, so what tools are needed in this situation? What kind of resources are worth organising to be able to provide in this situation, like the leaf blowers? What kind of resources can be useful in this specific situation? And I think that's kind of what I'm interested. You mentioned last time when we were having the chat last week about this idea that in a sense the book was a kind of toolbox or a set of resources that we're trying to develop, and I think that's I really liked that phrase at the time, and I think that's what I kind of want to pursue a little bit, and so but in relationship to what, tools and resources in relationship to what, as I say, in relationship to politics, yes, and in relation
I would say it's like a jazz, it's like jazz or the blues. It's you create a ghetto slang.
Yeah.
So you take certain terminology and you sing it out. You give it a different tone. You sing it out in a different way. You bastardize, turn things upside down. The very concept of Africa. Africa was specifically, it was used in a very racial way. It was a term that applied to the sub-Sahara, and it specifically applied to black people, but it didn't apply to Tunisia, where the term originated, and to people where they used the word Africa, and it didn't apply to people in the north of the Sahara. But then, in terms of the decolonial struggle, there was a reclaiming of the term.
Yeah, I mean that's the kind of you see that in the kind of Pan-Africanist element in the Black Power movement over in America as well. The kind of reclaiming of that relationship. Cunning being one of the comments, as you say, maybe something like cunning being the expansion of personal freedom. Yeah, I mean that's kind of what I'm thinking. Except it's prior to the personal self, the person. It is an expansion of freedom, I would say, without the personal there. But
So my last question for you today is in terms of the English white working class.
That's where I come from.
Yeah, but is there any reclaiming? Is there any other than accent? Is there, but which is often shame in relation to the accent? Is there any? Where's the blues? Where's the queer? Where's the
Well, you can see all those, can't you?
ghetto slang?
So where's the blues?
Can you?
Where's the blues? The Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Where's the queer? David Bowie. No, I mean, instantly you can come up with things, and that's before that's just from the 60s and 70s. We can track back into a whole bunch of work. Well, I mean, this is one of the things about working class culture is it's a culture in conflict. As someone who's working class, you're always, in a sense, in conflict with other people in the working class. You know, the racist arseholes, you know, the scabs in the workplace. You're always in conflict with other elements of the working class, as well as with the society at large. You're not generally in your day-to-day life in conflict with middle class people. If you have to, like me, go through the academy and learn how to do, you know, get your doctorate and all this kind of shit, you end up in conflict with middle class people. But most of the time, you know, if you're working class, you're not in conflict with middle class people because you never really see them apart from when you go to the doctors or you know, you get social workers come round or something. That's the only time you see someone who's essentially middle class in a way. Most of your average day-to-day life with your neighbours and the people at work or the people, you know, down the pub or in the club, you know, you're working class is a heterogeneous sort of space. That's, again, it's been made. You know, capitalism has made the working class. You're made into the working class, and then there's an element of that class that makes something of what they've been made into. But they do that, often they are only able to do that and make something of what they've been made into precisely by a kind of resistance, both to the culture around them or to the workplace around them or something, you know. And so you find people that, you know, as I say, you find people like...
Go ahead.
Yeah, you find people like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, or, you know, I mean, the Stones probably aren't particularly brilliant, but, you know, there's a whole bunch of working class culture that comes out that in a sense produces the 60s pop music. And
the Rolling Stones were upper class kids, I think, but the Beatles, yes, definitely working class. But don't the working class, in making something of themselves, don't they kind of collude and want to get out of the working class?
Yeah,
become middle class.
That's the general strategy presented to people, isn't it? Make something of yourself. That's the dominant strategy for, you know, getting out of a particular situation of class relations in particularly in the Western world. Yeah. I mean, I think it's different in different places. I don't think the same cultural relationships to class exist everywhere. I think, you know, Britain in particular has a particularly fucked up working class in many ways because it got so much. It was organised so heavily around, you know, the benefits of the colonies and the benefits of imperialism, and that still has huge impact, you know. And so we end up with things like the Labour Party, a kind of, you know, supposedly a party for the working class it's got fucking, you know, got no interest in most of what's going on, other than whether it can turn out enough people to vote. And of course, what we've seen in recent years is the complete loss of large chunks of that class in terms of thinking that they're going to vote Labour, and they'll do anything to fuck it up. And of course, there's no other strategy. There's no other route out. At the moment, the route out for a lot of people was being you know, voting fucking Brexit, or, you know, taking some other stupid option in terms of the Tories or some other political party. That was one route out, and the other route out is work hard and, you know, make as much money as you can and maybe buy a property and flip it or whatever. You know, it's the money route. So there's no other routes out offered to people. And so when you're inside working class politics and you offer a route out that involves, you know, political change, organising politically, making a difference politically, even that, you know, it's difficult to organise around that, because even that is still coordinated in terms of parliamentary politics, voting and all this kind of stuff. Now, these are kind of different dynamics that you'd have inside apartheid South Africa. You never forget, you know. I mean, I was reading earlier today about where the slogan "one person, one vote" came from, and it comes from the Freedom Charter. You know, and this is turned into the Labour. It's Mandela in the Freedom Charter, and in the 50s, and it turns into the Labour Party's like policy about how you elect a leader: one person, one vote, one member, one vote. But that was like in the South African situation, a massively, that the route out is let's get one person, one vote. Now that's not a route out. That's a route to capture, to being recaptured inside the UK. So there's a huge difference in terms of what we think of as working class. South African working class in the 50s and 60s is not, is able to take a kind of route of demanding parliamentary elections that are free, equal, and fair. Because even if it gets that, it's still going to kind of be able to make a difference. Although, maybe we saw something change when that actually happened. Whereas in the UK, that route out has kind of been shut down for decades. The route to parliamentary socialism, or whatever people wanted to call it, has been a dead end for donkey's years.
But I think the problem is the problematic is, and where there's commonality between the African experience and the UK experience, is the capitalist dimension, in that the working class, be it in Africa or in the UK, they want to be in the other person's. They want that house. They don't want to be in. They want that house. They want to have that nice car. They want the bling. They want the wealth. They want to be. There's an identification with, I want to be in that position. It's not that I want. It's very seldom. That's the one thing. And then the second thing is the frustration in relation to all of this is often expressed, and almost in the sense of trying to hold some sort of psychic stability, is expressed through violence. But the violence often then goes into the very working classes, towards women, towards. I know this is a gross generalization and it's not true, and there's all these kind of things. But just, maybe I shouldn't even say it. Football, people fighting against each other. But I mean, I know that's a simplification. But I'm just saying. But in a lot of the times, the gang warfares, it's within the same group. It very seldom spills across into the upper classes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the way in which society segregates out certain sections, and it's one of the things we've encountered with the virus, isn't it? Is that the capacity to segregate out sections of society is, I mean, it's still there inside the lockdown kind of process, but it's far more problematic. It's nowhere near as easy, and obviously it becomes even more problematic now we're trying to come out of lockdown and get people back into sort of spaces where they're shared again, because public transport spaces or shops, or these are, I mean, the level of segregation is there, but it's not, it's not fixed. So whilst you might have a bit of segregation around your grocery shopping and stuff, there's much less segregation around where you're buying your phones from, and where you're going to get your TVs and your white goods and all this kind of stuff from, and what kind of big shopping centres exist and all this sort of stuff. There's a lot less segregation around that, and the segregation around that is, I mean, the super rich obviously are in a completely different kind of category, but so I think some of it comes down to segregation. And it reminds me of when class war existed in the 90s, 80s and 90s. One of the strategies was things like stickers that said "Don't rob from your own." If you need to rob, go and rob from the rich, not from the poor, and all this kind of stuff. And there was a kind of conscious strategy of like trying to bring that point of consciousness up, that doesn't exist at the moment in the same sort of way. And isn't a strategy that I'm familiar with a lot of people sort of engaging in. But I do think it comes down to the fact that, as I say, that a concept of the working class as a cultural homogeneity, as a cultural singular thing, is just massively problematic. Culturally, it's always in conflict because it's playing through a series of conflicts in society. And there's a difference, I think, also between that kind of cultural idea of working class and a political idea of working class, in which the notion of middle class disappears. There isn't really, that idea that someone is middle class, kind of dissipates really in some sense in political theoretical constructions. And a lot of that idea of like, I want that over there. I mean, it's not it's a self-destructive and short-sighted dynamic, but at the same time it's like the next step is to get me out of here. How do I get out of here? Where do I want to? What's the options? And so it's one of the options on the horizon. So part of the difficulty of I think working class or revolutionary politics is how do you produce other options? How do you actually produce those as real options in which people can survive and thrive rather than just survive? Thrive. And so that's, I think, part of the interest behind things like commons, cooperatives, all this kind of stuff. People trying to produce what they call sometimes a solidarity economy, all these sort of things. He's trying to produce options outside of the only way of me having a retirement plan is buy 3 houses and rent them and turn myself into a renter, or something like that. Or the only way of having a bit of enjoyment or pleasure is to have the latest massive TV or the latest massive car or whatever it is. So I think it's a bit more of a complex thing when we kind of talk culturally or politically about things like the working class. But yeah, I mean, there's also huge differences between, as I say, kind of strategies that might work in the UK and strategies that might work in somewhere like South Africa. There's a massive kind of difference culturally in terms of what those strategies can offer us. Anyway, I notice it's now 9:30. We just never. So I'm definitely going to stop you now, because otherwise we're never going to get any family time, are we? All right, mate. Well, sorry about the bit of a mess at the start, and I think it was a bit chaotic this time. Next week we'll hook up again, maybe on Tuesdays if you want, yeah? Or...
So next week I'm just going to organise one large discussion around Black Lives Matter.
That would be great. And I'll have another stream on Monday, so feel free to give us a shout or something, or sort of I'll let you know what's going on.
No, I'm happy to join the streams, and I can be I can be quiet or whatever you want me to do. Just let me know.
Well, I'll see if I can get. I'll have to sort of I've had a bit of a test run, and there's a few issues I need to try and work out. But that's all good. I'll see if I can fiddle around with those over the week and see what progress I can make on that. Anyway, lovely to see you, man.
All right. Okay. Bye.
See you later, mate. Yeah, thanks a lot for... Oh, thank you, Fination Zuko. That's lovely for your follow. Thank you, Apostulusui. That's great. Have a good day, everyone in the chat. And as I say, I'll be around on Monday evenings. If you want to chat about something philosophically and you think I might have anything to say about it, you can check out my notebook11.com website to see what I kind of work on. But if you think I've got anything of interest to say, you're more than welcome to get in touch with me, and we can maybe have a chat, or I can look at something. But otherwise, I'll be talking about my research and what I've been doing that week. I will catch you later, everyone. Thanks very much.